Great.
Okay, well, Jane.
So why don't I start? Yeah. Thanks, Pat. I'm sorry. But I just put the agenda in the chat, and as I'm sort of just still catching up from being away for a week and a half, when I threw the agenda together last night, I realized I planned for an hour-long meeting and hadn't realized I had asked you all to be here for an hour and a half. So just want to say that we can try to work this efficiently and try to stay within an hour, and or also know that we have some extra time if things are taking longer to work through. And one of the other comments I'll just make is, since we've decided to hold these meetings with the public here, I didn't put on the agenda public comment, but I think that that would be something to add to the agenda to revise, so that at the end of today's meeting, we can provide a chance for the public who has joined to make comments for today. So let's just suggest that we'll try to stick to an hour and then offer for public comment at noon. And if we need more time, we can adjust as we go a bit.
So Jane, should I jump in?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So
any other comments on the agenda or expectations today? Now would be the time to make them, just before Pat gets going. Hearing none, the floor is yours, Pat.
Okay, great. All right, so we really want to use the survey as a device to think with together. It's not determinative. I want to be clear. The survey was just to help us focus where people are and to have the conversation we need to have to bring a scope or options for a scope to either the steering committee or the climate council as a whole. Jane, you can let us know which or both, so that they can give us guideposts and direction for what our task is going forward. So really, this is a follow-up to our scoping call, so we know what our scope is. And then next time, hopefully we will have that and can dive into the conversation. So I want to kind of explain a little bit how we got to the survey questions, but all errors and omissions are Pat's, if there are any in that regard. And Charlie, why don't you help me with that a little bit, so he can describe a little bit of his view on just why we asked the questions we did. We'll go through those, have a conversation, identify what we think is the scope and or questions about the scope that we ask for determination from the Climate Council. And then we'll go as long as we need to there. And then what we'll do is certainly invite public comment. And if we get through a lot of that and we are beginning to think about any experts we want to invite in, we may want to have a little conversation about that as well. If there's people we're thinking we want to invite in to talk about X or Y, even though we may not have the scope fully determined yet, we should just begin to think about that just so we can reach out to see if they're available. That sound okay? So the questions that I drafted the first set of questions for the survey just to try to tease out where you all were on a variety of issues that we kind of talked about in our first meeting around scope. So are we focused solely on electricity production by biomass? Are we also talking about thermal? What does it have in relation to all the other activities going on around the heat standard or the further evaluation work that's being funded by consultants and the like in terms of assessment work? So I did that. And then Charlie, who's clearly done a lot of good work with Judy around this issue and thought about this issue, kind of helped me refine some of those questions as well. But Charlie, is there anything else you want to add about kind of the survey itself before we look at the results?
No, I think it was an imperfect attempt to get at the different kind of focal areas we've talked about. I mean, we tried to limit the number of questions to something manageable, but acknowledging that they could have been kind of teased out into 100 different questions into different kind of more specificity. So appreciate that there. We did try to attempt to pick out some areas where we might already have some agreement, so we could kind of just move those to the side if that's possible. And then, as Pat said, I think a big part of this conversation is going to be trying to figure out, kind of, given people with more power in the state than us that have already decided a direction to go in, how much ability do we have to shift that direction, change the direction, reverse the direction? So that's something we got to figure out too, kind of like, what are the guardrails that we have to operate in?
So if people are ready, why don't we yeah, Rich, go ahead.
Well, just building on what Charlie just said, I think we, at some point, are going to need to discuss with the council, not just what is the scope of things that we might want to discuss or learn about, but what's our role? We're a small subgroup of, not entirely randomly selected individuals, but in some respects self-selected. And what are we doing? I mean, are we supposed to be, as you know, advising the council about topics that we think the council should be looking at in the future? Are we, do we have some other mandate? I think our mandate is entirely opaque. So maybe we're not going to decide this today, but I guess I just want to ask everybody to be, at some point, you know, pay attention to not only to what is it that we think are important topics, but also what do we think we have authority or jurisdiction or mandate to do about those topics.
Rich, to that second part, I want to ask Jane a question. And we want clarity on kind of the mandate as well as the scope, Rich. I think that's what you're asking, which makes a lot of sense. Is the task group advising the work groups, of which you are all on 2 of them, or 2.5, depending how you look at data and science, and then, or are they advising the climate council directly? Like who's the task group, quote unquote, report to?
Yeah, with the other task groups, it's pretty clear that they're working on behalf of a subcommittee, of which the subcommittee channels up the recommendations to the Climate Council. So some of this, you know, this is new chartered, uncharted territory a bit of how the council's working, and this one seems sort of more ripe with challenges than other ones. But I will, like, the transportation one is a good example of like a clear process where there's a clear mandate for the transportation, well, for cross-sector, I should say, subcommittee to come up with some additional policy recommendations that would be considered to reduce emissions in the transportation space, because we know that the climate action plan fell short in putting forward recommendations that would meet our transportation emissions requirements. And so that work group is working in service to the subcommittee in order to put forward additional recommendations to the council for their adoption at a later date. This one, it's cross-cutting, so ultimately there'll be 2 subcommittees involved in helping reach consensus on what the recommendations are that carry up to the council. I think Rich's questions and comments about the mandate and charge are good ones, and I hope that as we think about the scope today, we can come up with a process for how that sort of gets approved and considered by the council at the end of today's meeting. You know, as I looked at the survey questions and your folks' answers around them, I was struck by sort of the conflict between some of the answers to the questions, like an appreciation that perhaps the majority of you feel like the greenhouse gas inventory is not within the purview of this task group, but then another question later talking about the emissions and the greater good of biomass. And so that's like, they feel conflicting to me, some of the questions and answers. So I am curious about process, and one of my suggestions at the end, which we can talk about, is there are space at the council meeting on Monday to talk about subcommittee updates. And so I think that there's some time for us to think about how we would propose the work of these task groups and what they're charged with around process for us to consider with the council on Monday, especially in the space of biomass and what the next steps will be. So sorry, it's not crystal clear, but it's sort of new uncharted territory, and this group in particular is sort of pushing that limit of like consideration of what's in scope and what's out.
Judy.
Thank you, Jane. I thought it was crystal clear. I thought the Ag and Ecosystems spent a lot of time working on recommendations, and we sent them to the Climate Council, and there was clearly opposing opinions, and they got nixed. And that the purpose of this committee was to come to agreement on recommendations on the recommendations that we had placed in our report, and it seemed pretty clear to me. We've talked about that. to have recommendations sent in and just have a mix is not right without discussion. And I thought this committee was, the purpose of this committee was to have discussion and come to agreement on recommendations.
I think, Judy, to your point, I think certainly one of the very clear options to the Climate Council we could forward by the end of the day, and we'll talk about it, is essentially, to take those recommendations from the Ag and Eco Subcommittee that were not adopted by the Council in 2021, review them, explore them, revise them as appropriate, and resubmit them in whatever form, sometime in the future this year. So I think that could be one very clear scope. We suggest we need guidance from the council, and we need to talk about, I think, a number of issues that we raised in the survey, but I think that's one very clear way we could suggest. Jane?
I very much agree, Judy, with what you just said, and I think the majority of this group would. I think the question that I heard, and I wonder if I'm wrong on this, has been, in order to come to consensus on the recommendations from Ag and Eco, there feels like there needs to be, from some people, some scope and further work done, because in order to ensure that was the right suite of recommendations, because I've heard from you all loud and clear that there was time constraints on putting those recommendations together, and so maybe they weren't done with all the engagement that needed to be done, or all the back work that needed to be done. And so there's a question of like work that needs to be done in order to reach consensus on those recommendations, and what the scope of that work is to carry up those recommendations is where I see sort of the tension right now.
Yeah, I agree. That was discussed and agreed upon, that we needed more time to listen to experts. And so I would think that would be part of the scope here.
So what I wonder about is if we have a bit of conversation about the survey, and then we come back to that, even the framing Judy gave, and say whether that's sufficient to ask the council to just kind of put it in writing, a little more clear on the mandate, to Rich's point about like, who are we recommending to? Are we making and then just be done with it, or we need to kind of reconfigure another option for scope potentially. But I think maybe some conversation about the issues first from the survey, and then we'll come back to how we kind of frame up potentially scope options. Is that okay? Rich?
Well, I guess this is helpful conversation. I appreciate it. I would also just point out that if the way we proceed ends up implicating to a significant degree the way we do the inventory in Vermont and the way we calculate emission impacts, that we should be considering that there's a third committee that needs to be involved, and that would be Science and Data.
And Jane, you did reach out to them for a liaison or something, right?
Yep, I reached out to the co-chairs, and I have a lot of unread email right now from Vacation still, that there could be something in there, but I haven't noticed it, and have checked in with one of the co-chairs since being back, and it didn't come up. So I'll poke Megan O'Toole and Jared again just to see about engagement from Science and Data. But I did include them, and I don't think I've heard anything.
Don't we have someone here now that is from Science and Data? No.
TJ, you're not on Science and Data.
No, not anymore.
Okay. All right. Okay, and again, I think even if we don't decide the inventory within our bailiwick, I think that connection could be really valuable, Rich, anyway. So hopefully we can continue to explore that. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen so everybody can see. The bar charts in SurveyMonkey raw output are not that great, so I'm going to focus more on the data itself because it's just easier to make sense of. The bar charts are a little confusing to read. So there were 3 questions we asked that were just very broadly trying to get a sense of where you all were. One was on the inventory, to Rich's point that we just made. One is around the clean heat standard, and since it's already in place, is it a question of how but not if? And then we had a question which I realized was poorly worded, around where people were around construction of any new additional industrial biomass electricity production facilities in Vermont, which I realized was worded funkily. So that's why I think a few people said I couldn't answer because I didn't really the question was weird, which was totally fair. So we'll come back to that. So I want to first we can focus on the first line. So we had 5 people, or 5 of 6 people. I already filled it out. Thank you. five of six people said either agree or strongly agree GHG inventory is not necessarily within our scope, but one person strongly disagreed. And so I think that disagreement, people should articulate if they're willing why they disagreed, and we can have the conversation. And this is really again, we realize this survey was anonymous, but as we talk about it, you'll kind of reveal yourself, but we're a small group. I think we have to do the work we have to do.
I disagree because our conversation was about how the inventory was being calculated using a federal formula that was different than what we were actually seeing.
And Judy, just as a reminder, when, Ag and Eco, was that back when we were, I'm trying to remember, was that when, was Ally talking more about that? Just give us a little more detail.
Yeah, she sent us definitions, and she sent us criteria and all these different things, and it was comparing apples and oranges.
Jane?
Yeah, so I guess one of the reasons why I think this is out of the scope of this group, like very strongly, I feel this way, is that there is folks who are working on the greenhouse gas inventory. One, we've already done a greenhouse gas inventory critique where we looked at how we are in line with other states and found out that we are actually quite in line. It does not mean there are not ways to improve, especially the natural and working land sector, which are the recommendations from Ag and Eco. And we're pursuing both of those right now. We have Climate Alliance grants out to look at forests and the larger sort of land use sectors, natural land use sectors around forests, wetlands, and other natural components. And then we have a separate Climate Alliance grant to look at the ag inventory components of the greenhouse gas inventory, and are moving forward with the recommendations from Ag and Eco on that as well. And so there is a task group of the folks who have been working on the inventory, working on these questions. In addition, the work we already did a biomass sensitivity around looking at what the inventory would look like if we counted the emissions from burning of wood. And so we have some of that data already and can share that. And even if folks want to hear a presentation on it or talk about it, we can do that separately. But actually considering what's in the inventory and how things are calculated is not, I don't think, is within scope of this group. That doesn't mean there aren't other ways to get around the question of like, and this is like, I don't know if this is within scope or not, but I'm just saying that the inventory is a tool. There's also the larger question of like the promotion of like by burning wood for heating our homes or electricity, we're keeping forests, and that has better, larger good like benefits in Vermont. And that's a question that we could or couldn't ask, that this could be separate from the inventory, I think, in the way we promote working forests and the values that they contribute. So hopefully I didn't complicate that, but.
Charlie?
Thanks, Pat. To Judy's point, yeah, our ecosystem had a lot of conversation around the potential problems with the GHG inventory, led by Ryan and Ally. And my recollection was that we had advanced, or we and Ryan had written them, but we'd advanced recommendations of how the inventory could or should be modified. I just can't remember if I'm remembering that wrong or not, whether whether those recommendations went through to the full council.
Charlie, I believe those do, but I don't know that they said anything explicitly about biomass.
No, they didn't. And so the second thing I'd say is that if there's specific things around biomass that we want to look at, we could certainly, ask science and data to put it into their hopper. I just wanted to make sure that I was misremembering that the committee did advance recommendations specific to the inventory, and that actually made it into the final, which it sounds like it did.
Jane, it did, correct? Just to confirm. Yeah, okay. Judy. Oh, Judy, on mute.
I just wanted to make a comment about Jane's comment on there were other states that were agreeable with this. We talked about that, and Ally said that they are in agreement because the only formula they have to use. So we can, you can say we're in agreement, but we really weren't, because nobody went about to do anything different. And the other thing that we had as a discussion was the term working land. What is working land? And it's all working. It's all working to save our carbon, right? So I think there are quite a few things in there that need to still be considered.
Rich, did you want to say anything about, you had mentioned that actually the inventory just a second ago. Do you want to say anything more about the inventory and our scope here for a minute?
No, I think that if the Climate Council wants a working group to reconsider the way Vermont conducts the inventory, that they should explicitly create the working group and give them that assignment. But I don't think that we've been given that assignment.
So
I think that,
sorry,
Oh.
no, TJ, go ahead.
so, and just to follow on that, I think the council did want that, and they did create the assignment, and the Science and Data Committee did it. And I guess I do think there's follow-on process that's happening in that committee in terms of there's a request for information that has a whole bunch of different topics that is currently out now. Information to come back soon, and a technical consultant to then be hired from an RFP process to actually work on some of the updates to the inventory. So I think there's a space for that, and I would really be cautious about duplicating that work with this group.
So I would say two things. I think one is we certainly can ask that. We could certainly ask someone from, maybe if we have Megan now coming on board, which is great, we can actually, or a staff person, we can say, come in, just ask what they're doing on that, just so we know, right? It can be informational. I think the way to solve this problem is we don't have to reach agreement necessarily on this. We could just say to the council, we need direction on our role vis-a-vis the inventory. Yes, no, sort of. Judy, comment?
Yeah, and that's what this question is asking. Is it being considered in another space? And you're just telling me now it is being considered in another space, but we want to know what it is that's being considered, because we didn't agree on our committee.
Correct. So I think at the least, this group would just want to know what the other group is doing, right? That's just information. And then I think from the steering committee or the council, we just need to know, is that all taken care of over there, for better, for worse? We certainly can have an information discussion with them. Or does they feel that we need to actually do more on that? So I'm going to kind of do some of this just to keep us moving, because in some ways we just, when we don't have a strong recommendation, we have difference, we will just ask for clarity from the council. I want to go to the next one, which is on the clean. What we said was the council's already taken a stance on recommending policies for a clean heat standard and supporting fuel switching. So our sense is we can certainly explore all the ramifications of what that means in terms of how or implementation, but that since that's already been decided, to not revisit the if around the clean heat standard. And so what we had there was 5 strongly agree and 1 strongly disagree. So I wanted to just check in on that one as well.
Yeah, well, once again, I'm the one that disagrees, but what else is new? I'm not saying the council hasn't taken a stance. What I'm saying is that I'm not sure everything we recommended in this area was considered.
Right. And remind me, the clean heat standard came out of which subcommittee?
I can respond to that. It came out of cross-sector mitigation committee.
Okay.
And I think I have to respond to Judy by saying that the cross-sector committee considered it in quite a lot of depth. So the recommendation was very strong, and it had been considered in detail by the committee.
Yeah, it was in our committee too.
And I don't know how much time I want to spend today, but Rich, I think this is an example where the two subcommittees maybe can learn from each other, right? So I don't know what, maybe you can do the brief version of some of the thinking that went into the heat standard, Rich, from your perspective, how that relates to biomass, and just a little bit of information sharing here. And if we need more time, we'll have to set aside time.
Can I just say one thing, please,
Sure.
Patrick?
Of
One
course.
of the problems we had throughout our whole committee was the lack of communication between committees. And so with these questions, that's what I'm seeing. You're telling me this was done and that was done. We didn't have that information. And we gave opinions, we gave recommendations on all of these things, but I didn't see them observed or passed forward. So are you saying one recommendation is stronger than the other?
Rich, I think that might be helpful to give a little background, just again,
I can,
the price.
I have, Judy, I suffer from the same problem that you suffer from, which is that I wasn't in ag and ecosystems, therefore I don't know what you discussed. I do know what the council adopted, and I know what cross-sector said. And Patrick, for your information, the clean heat standard had been the subject of a year-long exploration by a working group. And that working group had a very detailed set of recommendations, a rather deep examination of all of the ways the clean heat standard could operate. And it explicitly includes a consideration of life cycle greenhouse gas emission impacts of all of the clean heat measures that qualify for credits under the standard. And that includes renewable fuels and also wood-based biomass heat. Advanced wood heat is explicitly included as a clean heat measure in Vermont. So, consistent with existing Vermont practice, frankly. So to answer your question, this question of the use of biomass, both liquid fuels from renewable sources and wood, was explicitly included in the recommendations of the cross-sector mitigation committee. So as far as I'm concerned, that topic was addressed, approved, and then passed on to the council, and the council explicitly adopted that standard.
Rich, a question just technically on the recommendation for life cycle costing of the emissions. Does that include for woody products, essentially I'm not sure if it's right, the trade-off, but like the notion of kind of keeping wood in forests for sequestration and storage vis-a-vis using it for fuel, and how that sort of pans out in a calculation overall?
The way that would be handled is however it is treated in the Vermont inventory.
I'd like to make a comment.
Yeah, go ahead.
Rich, I listened to many recordings of committee meetings, and every time they used the term clean energy, there was never any debate over the equity in clean energy. And there's many things that were recommended that I would not define as equitable clean energy. And that's what I often brought up at the Ag and Ecosystem that never got forwarded from any other committee that I listened to.
Well, I can assure you that a consideration of equity in the clean heat standard was built into the work of the working group, and then that report was adopted by cross-sector, and it has been incorporated into the legislation that's now moving in the House.
Well, actually, I can assure you it wasn't, because if you look at the chart we got to follow for equity, we got it on the last minute, and people, when I asked.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
When I asked if they used it, they said, nope, we didn't have any time.
Not that explicit chart. I agree with you.
So
Yeah, you're right on that.
a thought on this one is that I think the council adopted it. I think this group, for those folks who were not intimately involved, maybe understanding or having a review or kind of a brief information about it, including some of the details about the life cycle on the piece, might be helpful for information for this group, just as background, right? Because part of this is learning or teaching with each other about what you covered. Again, it seems to me the council's already acted. You can certainly ask them if this group can reconsider parts of it. I'm not sure that you want to. There's obviously a split in the survey, but I think we can ask for clarity there. But at the least, I think we want some education, understanding, and information sharing between the groups about it. That's different than necessarily recommending on it. I just want to go to the last one here too.
No, Patrick, I don't agree with that. I think that we should have the right to give recommendations. We did give recommendations. And if they took the report from the other committee, then they didn't consider our recommendations in this area.
And Judy, I have a question. This is what I just don't know. If the recommendations from the Ag and Eco, would they have affected, if they were taken up, would they have affected or changed the clean heat standard?
I would imagine, yes, because we focused a lot on equity. They didn't.
So
For
Judy,
instance,
Judy, maybe we just need to talk about this separately, because I honestly don't understand.
Well, let me give you an example
that you're making. Yeah.
Let me give you an example. One of the discussions we had was the inequities of electric cars, and how I asked where we would get the power, and I was told Hydro-Quebec. We've already relocated 11 tribes, and 5 more will be relocated in order to get the power we need for electric cars by such and such a date. Now, to me, that's not clean, that's not equitable energy. And the other issue is 80% of the biodiversity is in the hands of 5% of indigenous people in this world. And you're putting all their indigenous, or you're wanting to put all this indigenous land underwater. Where will the biodiversity be? How can that be clean? How can that be equitable? How can that be inclusive?
So Judy, I appreciate the point. And what you are saying right now is that if the clean heat standard depends in some degree on electricity for heat, you have a problem with that because of the sourcing of the electricity, some of it being from Hydro-Quebec.
Correct. Also, the sourcing of electricity for heat from biomass facilities. Also, the harvesting procedures for solar panels and how they're not harvested in a sustainable or equitable way. And there's no recycling plan to recycle these things when their life cycle is completed. There's
Okay,
so many things we've discussed, and you didn't see any of that in their report.
So you are raising a series of important and thorny questions. And my question for today is, did the Climate Council ask this biomass discussion group to address the questions that you are now bringing up, like equity associated with Hydro-Quebec? And there are perfectly legitimate questions. My concern is that I don't think the Climate Council asked us, this group, to consider them.
So I wonder, here's a question. So, because I think Judy, again, all concerns legitimate and important. For the scoping question is that, since our task is biomass specifically, not some of the other things that are important that Judy mentioned, I wonder if again, when we look at biomass and we explore it together as a group, if we think what we find or begin to recommend has an impact or contradicts some part of the clean standard regarding biomass, I think we would want to raise that concern as we go forward, but it would be particular to biomass for this purposes of this discussion.
I would think we'd also want to make a recommendation. That's what I was saying to you, Patrick. Our work should not recommend. I think our work should recommend.
And Julianne, you're just saying our work should recommend whatever we recommended, we should make recommendations, right? That's
Correct.
okay.
Correct.
And I think we should clarify that with the Climate Council, but I am assuming that is the intent here, that whatever our scope is within it, we are trying to make recommendations.
Because if we don't make a recommendation, Patrick, then whatever is there stands.
Yeah, correct. So I think we're going to need clarity for the council on, as we explore biomass, what is this committee's role vis-a-vis the inventory, if any, and vis-a-vis the clean heat standard, particular to biomass? And does this committee have room if we discover in our work that there are implications for either, once we understand what each is doing, can we make recommendations where the council can choose to take them up or not? But we need clarity from the council on this. There's one last big question we asked, which was poorly worded. So let me try to word it appropriately. The thing we were trying to get at in this last question, so the question, it's worded, our work should not recommend the construction of any additional industrial biomass electricity production facilities in Vermont, is kind of weirdly worded. It's almost like a double negative. What we were simply trying to say is, do people generally agree that we're not looking to expand biomass electricity production in Vermont? And we wanted to see if the group agreed or not. I think the answers are all over the place, probably because the question was badly worded. So I think we were just trying to get a sense of, is the group relatively okay with the fact that there is agreement that the existing facilities, whatever we view about them are, we're not seeking to have more facilities or larger facilities produce electricity via wood. And we're trying to test that question. So I want to kind of see where people are on that in whatever realm. So please, we got a much broader range of views there. So I'd like to know what people are thinking.
Patrick, you're adding more words to this sentence. So are you saying add any additional, or are you saying add any additional or expand?
Let me put aside sort of cogeneration, which is a side issue, right, to potentially a biomass electricity facility who could go and do essentially produce steam in addition or whatever. So let me put that issue aside. But I think the idea is here, anybody here feel like these plants could or should be expanded to produce more electricity via biomass, and or create new plants to create new biomass plants to produce electricity? So focus solely on the production of electricity, either expansion of existing to produce more electricity or new plants. And I just wanted to kind of know where people are. So Charlie and then TJ. Judy, thanks for the clarification.
I think the new versus expansion was intentionally separated, because I think one of the areas, at least the Ag and Ecosystem Committee definitely, I thought had agreement on, was that for a host of reasons, whether ecological or economic or whatever, like we weren't going to recommend we should build another Rygate or McNeil plant. We were going to focus elsewhere. And so I think this was just trying to get that one maybe nugget of consensus where we're not going to put forward a recommendation that says, hey, we should build another a plant similar to that at that scale. I think there's a separate conversation around expansion and what that would mean from ecological or equity considerations that we probably do, or maybe we do want to get into, but I think that's separate from kind of the nugget what this question was getting at.
TJ.
Yeah, I think Charlie hit most of it. I mean, I see the tabled item is address the use of biomass and while preventing the expansion of biomass for industrial scale commercial electricity production. I think that's what we're supposed to discuss. That's where what the Climate Council didn't take action on, right, and tabled. And that was the recommendation from the Ag and Ecosystems Subcommittee. I guess I'm not sure how to say, if you say no to that, then or yes, or should we even? I mean, if you say no to that question, then you're by default saying, well, maybe we should expand our infrastructure. But I think that's like pretty critical to the scope of what we're supposed to discuss here, as opposed to it just being decided kind of from day one. And I hope somebody will correct me if I have it wrong, because I wasn't in the discussions that created the tabled recommendation.
No, and one quick thing, Jane, could you put in the chat, that first recommendation, I think in our ag and ecos biomass recommendations was like no new plants or something. I can't remember the wording. I don't know if you could just pull that right out of those recommendations. That'd be super helpful. Thank you. Judy, go ahead.
We did have extensive discussions about expanding. And my recollection is Charlie was the only one that did not want to not expand what is there. And another huge component that has been left out of this discussion again is equity. There has to be fairness to all living and non-living things. We're talking about major archaeological sites for both of these plants, and to expand what could be problematic.
Right. So I think that's what we should discuss, right? So if the committee was recommending that no expansion, but the council tabled that recommendation for more discussion, then we have to, that seems like that's our scope, right?
That's right.
And with exactly the points that you're talking about. So kind of deciding on day one whether or not we are all in agreement. I feel like we have to do some work first. But.
Yes.
And I want to take Charlie and Billy. Maybe we can bring this one to a close quickly, saying yes, we need to talk about it. But Charlie, then Billy.
Yeah, and I think again, this might be the questions here are worded differently, but I agree with you, Judy. I think that the issues around expansion, I was taking as separate from let's go build something brand new. And I think the question, if we cycle down, we get it. Like, should we address the equity and the concerns that you raise around cultural, ecological, equitable considerations? I try to get at that at a different one, just to kind of try to tease them apart in a way where we could put one part to the side and focus on the other. But I do agree with you, Judy, that that's part, at least from my perspective, we do want to look at.
Billy.
You.
And just a point of order to be clear that these recommendations were not adopted by Ag Ecos. There was not consensus agreement amongst them. We ran out of time to work through our disagreements. So this is work that was done within the committee, but it is not the formal position of the subcommittee, is my understanding.
And let me just note then, I think that first clause that Jane put in, prohibit the expansion of, to TJ's point, is something we need to talk about. So I think that's in scope, and we'll leave it at that. And I think there is agreement there that we need to talk about it. Okay. I'm going to jump down. Again, bar graphs aren't that helpful. Sorry. All right. So here, I think we have a wider range of viewpoints. Let me go through a few of the things that we asked about here. We also had a few comments at the end. We asked specifically to Judy's and Charlie's last point. We asked specifically about, should this group take up the siting impacts of existing facilities regarding a number of things: land use, flooding, cultural resources, archaeological resources, all those things. We asked, should we talk about the GHG and other air emission impacts of existing biomass, electricity plants, so on and so forth. So if we spend all of our time on each of these, we may take too long, but when you look at the responses to all of this, I wonder what that tells us about what is maybe in scope or out of scope given the responses. And the responses are pretty mixed in some cases.
So I'll take a shot, and I think maybe it's easier because I hadn't been involved earlier for me to do it. But it seems like we should just be focused on the specific recommendations and the tabled actions. I think this was Judy's point before. We have these tabled actions and recommendations, and there wasn't consensus. The Climate Council didn't adopt them, and this group is intended to actually see if there is consensus and make recommendations, but there may not be. There's some inference that we will get to consensus. I don't know that we will, but either way, kind of just further flesh out these issues to and then make. And so I think what we're seeing on the screen here is kind of a mix of these issues sort of relate, depending on how you frame it, to some of the tabled actions, and it's a little tough to kind of match the two. And I would recommend we focus more specifically on those tabled actions and try and go through those and create a work plan for how we're actually going to address those and what needs to be included.
I mean, again, going back to Judy's formulation, if we focus on essentially the ag and eco recommendations that were not adopted, our job is to review them, consider them, revise them as appropriate, debate them, and then forward a set of recommendations, either them revised, or us with differences would then be forwarded. And we certainly can consider if in doing that, there are any implications to the inventory or the thermal heat standard. Liz, over to you.
Hey, thanks, appreciate it. Yeah, TJ's suggestion is a concrete way of proceeding, and so might be the right one. The only reason why, when I hear it, I wonder whether that's the right way to go is because I had understood when those recommendations came to the Climate Council, again, as a member of a different subcommittee who didn't sit on ag and ecosystem, that it wasn't a consensus recommendation of that subcommittee, and it was tabled by the Climate Council, which to me did not mean that it was a starting point. In other words, it might be the most concrete way to proceed because at least it's something in front of us that we can talk about, but I didn't take it as a consensus subcommittee recommendation that the council just didn't have its own consensus to adopt, but instead something that was not adopted after being not adopted by the subcommittee. So it still may be the right place to start, but I wouldn't want it to be sort of seen as more than it is, I guess, in that sense, if I'm right about that.
And Liz, I think what Billy helped clarify is what they were and weren't in terms of forwarded to the Climate Council. As you practically, they have a certain kind of framing, and so people may not like that. On the other hand, they're concrete and done and something for us to deal with, as opposed to try to rescope the whole thing. So that, as you pointed out too. So Judy.
Part of our issue was defining consensus. In the very beginning, I asked Jane for a definition of consensus, and I gave her my definition because consensus is indigenous government. And we all agreed to agree, or someone agrees to disagree for the betterment of the group. And the council changed the process at the very end to will vote and majority wins. And that's how some of these things got left out and some of these things got put in, is because we changed to a voting process opposed to a consensus process. And I would also like to add to the list of things that you talked about, Patrick, learning. One of the things that we need to do is continue to learn. One of the questions we had was, do we have time to bring in experts? Do we have time to learn from experts? And we were told no. And I think that should be something that this committee has the power to do, to learn from others who do know.
Jane.
Yeah, so a couple things. I do think the learning component is really important here. I will just say about consensus, the voting policy that was put in place by the steering committee towards the end was never used at the subcommittee level. I'll just say we tried it once in ag and eco as a test run, if I remember, around a wetlands policy, a no net loss on wetlands policy, and didn't actually end up using it. And this got tabled not because of a vote or a lack of vote. It was just that there wasn't time to reach consensus. And so we carried it up to the council as is, knowing that more work needed to be done at the subcommittee level to reach consensus. And so I appreciate that, setting those ground rules and expectations for how this task group is going to work to reach consensus on this issue and or vote, whichever the group wants to. is important from the onset, so that there's not a target that's being moved at the end from anyone here, and setting the right timeline in order to meet whatever the group agrees upon for consensus or voting. And then finally, I want to echo what Liz said is really important. I do think that was a contributing factor to why the council tabled these actions, is that there was not agreement at the subcommittee level yet, and certainly not time at the council to reach agreement. So time is important here to consider how much time is needed to get to the end game.
I'm going to try a formulation in the chat, so just take a look there. We can futz with this, but let me read it to you. So it's to review, explore, learn, discuss, revise, if decided by you all, and forward recommendations to whom we need to know, or the range of views, if we don't have agreement, on the 2021 Ag and Eco Subcommittee Biomass recommendations to the Climate Council. If there are implications in the task group's work for the GHG inventory or clean heat standard, those should be raised by the task group to the council. I'm sure it could be better worded. Yep, and Judy, we should absolutely add in what I think has been the kind of key principle of the whole council's equity as part of it. So we can absolutely add that in.
Yeah, I wouldn't call out just the GHG inventory or clean heat standard. That whole second sentence maybe is implied. If there's implications to anything relevant to the Climate Council, that those should be identified, right? You could call like a clean energy standard in the electric sector, or just the economic impacts or cost effectiveness, or there's a whole range of topics that if there's enough information to actually make a point about that, we should just do it.
And maybe we could say, Jason, like if there are implications to the Climate Council 2021 recommendations overall, we should raise them.
Yes, I'm still uncomfortable. These are not formal recommendations from the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee. So I think we can say working off this draft, but I think we just need to hold that data point throughout this conversation.
What would we call that? Totally fair. What would we call what was forwarded? They were the non-consensus Ag and Ecosystem Biomass recommendations. What were they? I just need to give them a name.
It was a working draft, I think, at that point. I would defer to others who are on the subcommittee who are working more closely on this, but I just on how to characterize it. But
Rich, did you have another point you wanted to make? No.
Sorry, my phone was ringing there. Yeah, I do have another point to make. Patrick, I'm a little worried about your phraseology. I think I understand your intent that if we find that there are implications for the council to consider generally regarding other work of the council, that we should identify it. And I think that's okay. The problem with the phraseology is that it appears to then invite us to go way out of scope in our conversations. And as opposed to confining our discussion to the mandate, which Jane has put in the chat, and then perhaps inviting us to say, yeah, and if as we look at those issues, there are implications for the way we do the inventory, or for something in the power sector recommendations, then with respect to those issues, we can identify cross connections to the council. But simply to say that we should identify to the council any issue that is related to a tabled recommendation of ag and ecosystems that has a cross connect with the rest of the council's work in any way, it seems to then invite us back into the same conversation we're having today, which is what's our scope?
Rich, is there a way to word that differently or better, or in a way that gives more sideboard, so to speak?
Well, why don't, there is a way. I mean, I would say we're discussing the issues that Jane has identified. I mean, I think that's what we were asked to do. And you all can correct me, okay? I'm, you know, I don't have a transcript of the meeting in front of me, but Jane's 2 entries in the chat, one begins with the phrase prohibit the expansion of, and the second one is existing facilities shall, A through E. And that seems to be, in my memory, that's what we were asked to look at. And so I guess I would say, oh, now I'm looking at yours, Patrick. Review, explore, learn, discuss, revise, if decided. I would say if our consideration of the topics that Jane listed, you know, implicate other aspects of the Climate Council's work, they should be identified for consideration by the council.
And then TJ made one suggestion, just don't be silent on this question, and we can it comes up. So it's another option too. Judy.
Yeah, this has been the touch point of a lot of what Ag and Eco talked about. We talked a lot about silos and academic silos and the problem with working in a silo, and how you pull on something in nature and you find out the rest of the world is connected. And that we should be looking at this more holistically and include a global perspective to what we're talking about. And so to limit ourselves does exactly the same thing. It puts us right back into a silo and out of looking at the issue holistically and from a global approach. Like I mentioned earlier, looking at what's happening in Quebec and Newfoundland compared to where we're going to get our electricity. And so I do think that we have to consider what pops up and make recommendations as it pops up to what we're discussing.
So I tried a slightly different formulation, TJ. It doesn't take your potentially good suggestion up, but I tried another crack. I included equity, tried to use Rich's words. And Billy, I changed the word from recommendations to considerations, for lack of better terms. And in the enough clarity we have and boundaries that then we can actually go to work, right? That's our goal here, is just to scope it well enough. We are clear what we're doing and we can get to work.
So are you saying that, Patrick, are you saying that they should just be identified and not have a recommendation?
I'm being vague, so I think it would allow you to make recommendations if you wanted to on additional things. You could say, you could say, because we explored this, it would affect the inventory. And because it would affect the inventory, we think we need further research or reconsideration of issue X. I mean, that I imagine that's what could flow. But it is vague. Rich.
So, Patrick, I just want to ask whether your phrase on the 2021 Ag and Ecosystem SC biomass considerations to the VCC, is that phrase intended to include the 6 items that Jane listed
Yeah.
specifically, but not to include or to try to be inclusive of all of the discussions and considerations that may have gone on in ag and ecosystems that are outside of those 6 listed items.
I think the intent would be that, the subcommittee without consensus, as Billy said, forwarded that written document of, what is it, 2 pages, Jane? I can't remember. And that's kind of this thing we would then focus on talking about, discussing, learning more about, revising, arguing about, whatever it might be. And that would be our scope. It doesn't mean we wouldn't rehash some of the conversation that happened in the Ag and Eco for sure, but that is our document to then work with. So thanks, TJ. I'll do that. Sorry about that. Good point. And we can, Jane, if we can go back and rewrite this to make sure we've got the title of the document accurate, and that's to be really as precise as we can be. And Judy, it's an attempt to just capture what you said at the beginning of the meeting to try to be clear about what we're trying to do.
Well, the reason I'm asking, Patrick, is that as I read Jane's list, it specifically discusses policies and decisions around biomass electricity. And there are a lot of other biomass issues that I think, we haven't been asked to look at. But I recognize there's a lot of issues in, the relationship between biomass and climate, and biomass and equity, and biomass and the economy. There's a world of issues. And I think a lot of them are important, but I'm trying to clarify the scope of this discussion group. And I think the way Jane has written it is fine. I'm prepared to discuss all that. I think I don't think we are being asked by the Climate Council to consider manure management or soil carbon fluxes in Vermont, and there's a million other things we're not being asked to look at.
Let me put I want to put kind of the title of the biomass tabled actions in here, because I think that may or may not be helpful, but this is what was in that document. So it does, that is the broad frame which the Ag and Eco forwarded to the Climate Council. Again, not by consensus.
Yeah, and I did just above that, I was able to PDF the tabled actions separately, and they're on today's meeting site now, and they're above. So you'll see the overarching statement that Patrick put there, and just an appreciation that there's 6 specific recommendations, of which there's sub recommendations underneath those 6. So it's a lot more extensive than that one that I put in the chat up top there. So that link will give you the full picture.
I'm sorry, I don't have the document in front of me. Are they all related to biomass for electricity?
No.
No.
Right.
Yeah.
So
no, that's why.
Okay.
There are, I mean, I can share my screen, but there's work discussion about research in this area. There's around fuel. It's quite broad. There's a recommendation: the following considerations should be accounted for if permitting any new pellet producing facility in the state. And then there's a number of sub recommendations under the pellet consideration. So, and then the one below is flow of wood pellets for wood derived. Yeah, I would encourage folks to look at them. I think they're a good starting place, but they're broader than just.
But I think the reason I put that broad first statement in is that the things that flow from that cover all these things. So we certainly are addressing kind of electricity generation by biomass, but we're also talking about essentially the sourcing of product for thermal heat generation as well, and at those different scales. So of the 6, Jane mentions they cover some different things. Judy.
That's what I've been talking about, Rich. Everything is related. Everything is connected. If you start siloing everything, you don't make those connections. You don't see them. We have to get out of the mentality of looking at everything in a silo. We have to look at it holistically. So it has to be much greater.
Rich, go ahead.
Well, I'm going to restate my point, I guess. Judy, I agree with you. I'm a lifelong environmentalist. I've been studying these connections and working on them for my entire career. My issue is, what is the charge for this group? If the entire world of biomass and well, is it even just biomass? Because if we're considering the entire electric system, then it's even beyond biomass. We're looking at a much broader world. So the question is, what's the charge from the Climate Council to this group? And if the charge is to consider everything related to biomass, then I think the council should tell us that that's what they want us to do.
So I think, again, scoping can be really important. So I don't want to diminish the importance it can be to spend the time to do it. I'm also aware of limited time to kind of dive into the topic. So I wonder if you all go to the Climate Council and/or its steering committee and say, here was the work Ag and Eco did without consensus. It listed out a range of issues you can see for yourself. Our assumption is that we are to take that and review, explore, learn, discuss, revise if decided, for recommendations or a range of views based on that, including definitely considering equity. Is that our charge? And then let the steering committee or Climate Council tell you yes, or take only parts A and B, or whatever they decide to tell you to do. I think that, to me, that you at least have a foundational document, as imperfect as it may be, to ask for clarity on whether you're discussing all of it, some of it, or the like. That seems like the most straightforward way to go, but if people feel differently, let's talk about it in a little bit of time we have left. And Rich, to your point, then, if they do say yes, take all of these things and discuss them, then it does bring in a number of things around biomass. Doesn't necessarily bring in clean water per se, but it certainly brings in biomass and its different elements at different scales. Judy.
Well,
The scope of the Climate Council is broad enough that it could include agricultural policy, revising current use rules, land development policies, all kinds of things. But then again, we're back in the conundrum of a small ad hoc working group being given the mandate to reconsider the entire climate plan, which doesn't make sense to me.
Right, but hopefully that's not the intent, I hope, to your point, because you're right, that would be a lot of work for 6 people. Judy.
It would also be a very limited direction with so many in one opinion and so few in another opinion. And we wouldn't want to end up with research that is steered by the majority of the committee. Yeah, I just want to ask Jane a question. Jane, did you that last link you put with everything we were talking about that said tabled actions, did that go to the council? And so did they have that in mind when they gave us a charge to do? Yeah, so
yeah.
so why do we have to go back to the council if they already know what we want to do?
I guess I appreciate that question, Judy. And I guess one of the challenges becomes it was all very rushed at the end, obviously, as you can imagine. And I think it's worthy to understand and explore with the broader group appreciation of what the actions are asking, and just understand the scale and scope of the implications in consideration from those, and create some expectation for what the process will look like to reach consensus on them, to bring them back up to the council. So I think that no other task group is really going to the council or anyone else to check in at this point. They're moving forward with the work as they see it appropriate. So this one just seems to have broader implications as we've been discussing, and so it might make sense to understand.
Right.
Let the council understand that from the onset.
So I'd much rather say to the council, we gave you this list and this is what we see as our scope, rather than have them try to limit what our scope is.
Judy, to that point, I
Yep.
think if we essentially took this thing I just put in chat and made a slight revision, and then we put that on top of the ag and eco consideration piece that was tabled, and say, here's our scope as we understand it, please confirm. And then you're presenting them a proposition which they need to say yay or nay to or alter. So I'm aware of the time, and we want to give a little time for public comment. So can anyone not live with essentially, and we can, if we need to revise a little bit further between, we can, but essentially live with the thing I put in chat, which is the overstatement, then the document, and then we ask the Climate Council for confirmation that that's in fact our scope, and that they confirm that very clearly, or give us a different direction if they decide to do so.
Again, Patrick, why are we going back to them if they already saw what our scope was and discussed it?
I think here's my main thought is, I don't know what the other ones are doing, but I would say, I think having something in writing for all of us is really, really helpful. And we don't have anything in writing from the Climate Council or the steering committee. So for my sake as facilitator, I would like a charter that's in writing. And I think that's what all we're trying to do. I don't know what the other groups are doing, but for, just as your facilitator, I'd support something in writing from the, the overarching body, so that we are clear and we can then go forward. That's the reason I would ask for it.
So I think then I would, in your little sentence, your little, whatever you call it, verb, I would make a comment to that document that Jane put in the website.
And that maybe we need to reference it specifically. That's what the intent of the ag and uses and biomass considerations to the VCC that were tabled, but maybe we need a very explicit reference. So you're right. So it's no one's confused.
Right. I would make reference to that, because that's what the entire committee agreed on.
And I think that I should clarify that the other substantive work group right now is the transportation work group. And there was a memo prepared by the folks leading that sort of spelled out the charge in front of them and the process that they envision in taking to actually reach the end point, point on that one. And so the transportation is not dissimilar from what transportation's been doing to keep the council, the subcommittee, others informed. And so I think this would be important not only to share with the council, but also with the two respective subcommittees that you all represent, in order to keep them apprised of the process that your task group, the work, the scope that you're doing, and then ultimately what we haven't gotten to is the process to reach consensus around these tabled actions.
Judy, we'll have to find
a working draft.
We'll find the exact location on the website by put reference explicit, which we'll have to find, to your point. So again, can anybody not live with that? That would forward to the Climate Council for clarity, and then we can proceed next time to start diving in. It's not perfect, but it's something. TJ, can you live with that? Okay, Billy. Okay, Liz, Judy. Oh, Judy, you're on mute.
My phone keeps ringing. I can live with it if you add that link or a comment to that link.
Okay, and we'll add that reference explicit. We'll put that in there. We'll find that link and add that in. I just don't have it right now. Totally fair. Great, Charlie. Rich.
I'm okay with it, provided that we ask them, is this what you want us to do?
Okay, then I'm not okay with it. If you ask that.
Well, Rich, are you okay saying here's what we want to do, and then they can say yes, no, or
Well,
Exactly.
I don't, then I don't agree, because I don't think it is what we want to do. And I don't think it is what we were asked to do, frankly.
Well, if you got that paper that Jane put in the chart and you saw what we wanted this committee to do, then I'm sorry if you didn't read it, but that's what we wanted it to do.
That's what you wanted the council to adopt.
It's recommendations.
Right, it was a recommendation.
For
Well-
further investigation.
Okay,
Says address the use of biomass for appropriately scaled institutional resident. There's a whole list of things. It's
So-
3 pages long.
so Rich, I think I'm trying to figure out how to do this so we can get this to the climate council, just have them give us directions. We are asking for direction from this. We're trying to describe it for them as best we can. I don't know what the original intent was. I have no idea. And if they think it was different, I think they can tell us. So I wonder if you're okay with, maybe you're not, here's what we think we can do going forward. Is this right or not?
Patrick, I want to make a statement. This is what we're doing.
Right.
As prescribed by the document that they saw given from the ag and ecosystem.
And I just need to see whether Rich can buy into that or not.
no. We don't need to have consensus here. I can just, my memory of the council meeting in which this was discussed was that the council understood that ag and ecosystems did not have consensus. And it was a really complicated and controversial set of topics. And the council said we're tabling this. I don't recall that the council created at that time a task force to take up the tabled matter and to reconsider all of it in a new committee. Now, maybe I missed that part, but it was tabled because there was no consensus coming from ag and ecosystems, and further, the council as a whole didn't accept the recommendations.
So this is exactly why I define consensus. We do have to have consensus here. If they recall as a group, they don't remember, they can tell us that. But we have to have consensus. That's what consensus is for. You can't change the form of government halfway through and say, we don't have to have consensus. Let's take a vote, or let's take my word. You can't do that. That's what consensus is for.
So Rich, I just want to check, because I think Rich, then why do you think we are here? Or what is our charge? If it's not that, what is it? Or what do you think?
I thought the explicit charge was to consider the policies associated with electric generation based on biomass.
So you thought the focus was strictly on biomass and electricity generation?
Yeah, but listen, I'm not going to oppose Judy's statement to the steering committee or to the council. If the council wants us or wants to constitute a group to consider broadly the future of biomass in, really broadly, then the council can do that.
Jane, you want to describe what you just put in chat there?
This is in the implementation section of the climate action plan. there's a bulleted list of next steps for the Climate Council, one of which it discusses picking up the tabled actions for further discussion. And then the next paragraph based in the plan is all that's said, but it talks about a particular focus of the council in the near term to focus on further consider tabled actions. And that's what it calls these as particular about, and there is a chart that spoke to the biomass tabled actions, and it does say, it talks about it for thermal heat regarding climate mitigation, co-benefits and impacts.
Oh, okay.
Anyway, that is what it says in the plan.
So Jane, thank you for the correction. If that's our charge, then that's fine. That's our charge.
So
Oh,
then,
do we have consensus?
But do we have consensus as to, how do you say this? What is said in the plan, I accept. And so we have consensus as to that.
Okay, that leaves a lot of wiggle room there. Do we have consensus to what Patrick has in the chat with, he's going to add the recommendations that the Ag and Ecosystem submitted?
I think that's fine, but I would like to be clear with you, Judy. I don't want to be coy at all. I think that this working group as constituted is not well prepared, not well constituted to reconsider all aspects of biomass in Vermont. And for a bunch of reasons. And one reason is that it implicates directly the inventory. And we've said we're very inconsistent in our thinking. We say we don't want to reconsider the inventory. And then we say later that we want to reconsider everything having to do with biomass. Those positions are inconsistent. And I think that the council needs to tell us which way to go on that.
Which is why I asked Patrick to add the word learn. My expectation is experts will come and help us to learn.
So I if I could just add too, the tabled actions, I'm not sure if they're everything about biomass. There's a number of specific actions in the document, and it does implicate greenhouse gas inventory. For instance, it says the following greenhouse gas impacts should be accounted for when developing policy and associated regulations for biomass. Has a number of items, but I think that was not a consensus recommendation of the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee. It was tabled by the Climate Council, and task one for that particular item is, well, this subgroup should learn what is in the inventory, what the inventory process is with the Science and Data Committee, and whether or not this is an action that should continue to be recommended. Maybe the recommendation is we don't need to do that anymore and it can kind of be removed from this consideration, or maybe it's the greenhouse gas inventory and the Science and Data Committee are missing something and we need to make a recommendation there. But to me, it sounds like that we have the tabled actions, it's in the climate action plan. It's our job. I actually agree with Judy. I don't know why we're going back to the Climate Council, honestly. I think we should take action and just start developing a work plan, because it seems very clear to me. And you know, I've listened to this back and forth and trying to kind of push us to like, let's start funneling towards a work plan, because that's what it is. That's what we're asked to do. And there's no decisions on any of these items that were tabled. I don't think there's any decision. We have to like come to, what are we going to do with this? Is it ripe for this committee to make a decision? What do we need to know? How will we know it? We ought to figure all that stuff out.
So could we take TJ's practical advice and simply say, Rich, if you're okay with the broader recommendation in the Climate Council report, final report, that we just start plowing through this document and exploring those issues as named. It doesn't mean you agree to the document, we're just exploring them and learning, as Judy said, and we just start marching through. Again, not necessarily in the order they're in. We may have to think about some order, which we can do, but if anybody's uncomfortable with that, say so, and maybe we can just start proceeding, which would certainly, I think people would want to start getting into the topic. Charlie, thumbs up. Others, Judy, yep. Liz is shaking her head, yes. TJ, Billy. Rich, you're thinking.
Well, I actually believe in consensus decision-making, so I'm okay with going along with you all. It seems to me that this working group is taking on, if we go through all those issues, quite a large body of work.
Yep.
And I have my doubts as to how successful we can be doing that.
Yeah, I might add that in what I said, I agree with you, Rich. I think we should decide on, whether this is the right group to take on particular issue. And maybe the recommendation is no, it's a different group or something like that. But that's all, I think it's all to be determined. And we just need to really start looking at the issues and see how we want to tackle them.
Charlie.
Yeah, I would just say, I think that, one of the things that we want to do that the committee didn't have time to do is not to necessarily like take the focal area and dive right into it, but to figure out first and foremost, like, is anybody already addressing this somewhere else? And if so, who's doing it and where is it being done? Or if it's not being done, who is the appropriate entity to do the work? So I agree that, like, if this can be looked at as us biting off way more than we can chew, but I think part of our work is going to be sorting out kind of like what's already happening in this space, what do we learn from that, and then where do we go with that information? I think you're right that we could go down a deep rabbit hole, but I think one of our first tasks is to kind of do a lot of sorting and learning, as Judy's pointed out, at a higher level first.
So let me make this suggestion, and Jane, I have to turn over to you for public comments. I unfortunately do have to jump at 12:30, but I think we've got an approach going forward. We're not needing to, no one here feels like we need to go back to the council. We've got it in the document. We've got the written document from the subcommittee. We're going to start marching through, and as Charlie and TJ described, exploring it with the recognition that Richard said this may be way more than we can really bite off and chew, but we're going to find out. And so if you will give us a little bit of grace, let Jane and I think about how to organize the next meeting to start talking about the substantive part, partly to Charlie's idea about, let's talk about each of these, think about what we know, don't know, who we might need to get help with, and we'll just start diving in some regular fashion. Okay. Not perfect, but we have a document. We have some clarity from the Climate Council and writing from the final report. So I think we begin to dive in with the recognition, big topic. Okay. Jane, with that, I think I'll hand it to you maybe for any public comment. And I apologize that I have to jump only because of another commitment.
Nope. Thank you, Pat. And thanks everybody for getting there. I do just want to say before we turn to public comment, there is no space formally on the council agenda for this on Monday, but there are subcommittee updates and a space for that. So I would just encourage Rich, you and/or Billy, when there is the chance for both Ag and Eco and cross-sector to make comments about updates on the ongoing work, just to sort of speak to this final decision made today and the work in front of us. So thank you for that. With that, any public comment? I'm happy to have folks raise their hand and/or turn their cameras on, and I'm happy to call on you. George, please go ahead.
Good afternoon. I have multiple comments. I've been trying to take notes as I proceed through this. So most of my Climate Council observations were in the cross-sector mitigation and science data committee. And I was relatively, should we say, I just didn't have the cycles to also look at ag and ecosystems. Although I hold the work they produced in high regard, it's a tough topic and it needed a lot of addressing. When I look at the clean heat standards, I did want to point out that the clean heat standard is currently written and is being reviewed in the legislature. As far as I'm aware, as proposed, it does not have a mechanism to support an income sensitive price for thermal energy. So if in fact there are market impacts from the clean heat standard that do raise the cost of fuel, there currently exists no mechanism to soften that for those who are of lesser means. And that is an equity issue, I think is an important shortcoming of the clean heat standard, and it needs to be addressed. And I think it's going to have heavy headwinds in the legislature because of that very topic. Earlier this week, I attended a EPA-sponsored workshop on greenhouse life cycle emissions modeling. It was basically a field of global and national, well-renowned, top-tier researchers who convened. I think altogether the audience was several hundred people. And through the progress through that workshop, my next comment really has to do with some of the things that were discussed by these folks who are at the front line and best available science in the field of greenhouse life cycle emissions. It's become increasingly clear that one of the things that goes on in the land use area for biofuels, specifically in the federal renewable fuel standard, but obviously applicable to other forms of biomass energy, is the land use change and the indirect land use change impacts of taking a large fraction of land that used to be used for food or other purposes and reallocating it to bioenergy. And local to Vermont, that looks like taking forest land that might be currently not actively logged and converting it into a logged forest. One, I think the takeaways from that is how much uncertainty there is in measuring life cycle emissions of these systems because they're biogenic and very complex. Nonetheless, they did point towards a tool in their current repertoire, which is called consequential life cycle analysis, which is a suite of tools that are still in development, but nonetheless are much better at measuring the total life cycle, given you have land use policy involved. And so far, I've not heard any recognition or discussion of that either here in this group today or at Science Data, and I think that needs to be folded into their work. Even if you were to step forward and do that, it could only, a consequential LCA analysis would probably only do the economic and climate impact dimensions, but it would not be capable of doing the equity and environmental services aspects of this problem. And I think both equity and environmental services have been kind of neglected in the conversation. I don't see Science Data, for example, putting a price tag on the environmental services, having higher water quality and better resilience against flooding. If you have lots of forest land, it's got lots of depth and carbon it's in its soils, as an example. So I guess to the extent that the cap depends on biomass as a climate mitigation method, it really needs to quantify the cost and damages to the climate. The societal equity has to talk about and actually quantify the environmental services that are caused by land use changes and then damaged by logging the forest. And all that's, I think, in scope of this group and hasn't really been brought to the front line in the Science Data Committee. So I think there needs to be a liaison between the two organizations, the subcommittee that's doing science data work and also all the expertise that's brought in by this group. So I'll leave it at that. I hope you guys can come to an agreement on a consensus of your charter. It's important work. And I think bioenergy has a lot of opportunity to go in either a good or a bad direction, depending on your work. If it's not sustainable, it will become a huge problem with irreversible consequences. Thank you.
Thanks, George. Thanks always for meaningful comments. Annette, please.
I don't know if there's any point in making this comment, but I don't think that this subcommittee is populated properly. I don't know if there's a mechanism to add people. But I do recall it was discussed when the idea of forming a subcommittee that would merge science and data and ag and, or not science and data, but cross-sector mitigation and ag and ecosystems to come together. And there was some discussion about bringing in some different people. I would highly recommend Zach Porter, who has just a vast wealth of knowledge on forests and biomass and trees, and George Gross, who brings in just a fabulous perspective on data. I would very much like to participate actively rather than having to constantly be on the sidelines based on my work both on land use and issues and electricity issues. There may be others, but I wonder if the door is closed. I will also, and I don't really like doing this, but I want to share the observation that based on this meeting, it appears to me that Richard Cowart doesn't really want to even participate in a discussion. He spent most of the time trying to narrow and make the discussions not happen. And I've found this to be pretty much a waste of my time with the kinds of fighting that's have gone over the scope of work when I felt it was very clear when these recommendations or not recommendations were brought to the full council in I will note, an extremely compressed and rushed time, having watched both ag and ecosystems and cross-sector mitigation and the full council. I have seen the progression of this and think that this is a very important conversation to have, and to constantly be having someone who's just trying to obstruct the conversation is not productive. And I would like to see this conversation happen in an effective way without some, predetermined outcome. So I apologize if I have said things that are really not appropriate, or, as seems to be most of my input, not really relevant, because nothing that I think I've ever said in any of my public comment has ever been taken into consideration. I think that this subcommittee needs to be expanded, and it needs to bring in people who want to work on this topic and find solutions. Thank you.
Rich, you're welcome to.
Yeah, so yeah, and that since you personally called my name, I'd like to respond. I want you to know that I think this topic of biomass is a very important topic. My questions today were just really focused on what's the right way for the Climate Council to launch an investigation into a topic that is quite complicated, and affects ecosystems, equity, economics, how we heat our homes, how we electrify our economy, etc. So I really agree with you. I think it's a really important topic. I'm not trying to shut down discussion of it at all. And I agree with George that there's a lot of issues, and there's a lot of emerging science that a working group could pay attention to. And I just want to be clear to you and to my fellow committee members that, notwithstanding that it's a really important topic, because it's a really important topic, I think the council should be considering very carefully how it wants to constitute a working group to work on it, or commission research to support the working group, and not to just handle it or try to handle it with such a small, unofficial, unstaffed, or virtually unstaffed, sorry, Jane, working group. So, Annette, I agree with you. It's really important.
Cheryl, thanks, Rich. Cheryl, please go ahead.
Hi, everybody. First of all, I'm really glad that these are public meetings now. Thank you, Jane. And I have to tell you, I agree with both George and Annette on all the issues, actually, all the things they brought up. I also want to especially talk about the fact that I think that the membership here is skewed. It's a little biased. It's a little heavy on one side versus the other. And there's not a lot of science here, which I think really needs to be. Speaking of which, biomass and forests are still being dealt with using old research, old outdated information, and there's a lot of new information going on, especially with regard to age of forests and carbon sequestration. And I don't even know if the new greenhouse gas emissions counting the new way of looking at what's going on with size of trees, age of forests. And I highly recommend getting some people in to talk about that. It's not easy to find the new information and the new research. You know, Bill Keaton is a really good person to get in here. There's no reason for anybody on this task group to move forward without finding out about what's going on in forests, current research, current knowledge, not what's being used in like the federal, the National Forest Service or Vermont even now, because there's a lot of new stuff going on. And it's not just Bill Keaton doing that, but he's a great one and he's right here. And as some of you already know, I'm also very happy to join this group and share my knowledge and work on these issues because I have been studying this a lot for a couple of decades. Let's see. Okay, I guess there's not really much reason to move forward, but I also wanted to say that I was very clear on what this group was supposed to do. And I'm glad that you guys finally came to it. What you have ended up with is exactly what many of us knew in the beginning of what this group was all about. And thanks very much.
Thanks, Cheryl and George and Annette for your comments and sticking late. And thanks to the whole task group for staying late. Pat and I are going to touch base later today on next steps, and I'll look to schedule a meeting with you all in the next week or two to keep the work moving forward. So thanks, everyone, and look forward to seeing many of you at the council meeting on Monday. So have a nice afternoon.